want to jump to there's a lot of very interesting stuff here. Number one, the Shulchan Aruch in chapter 186, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he mentions that women are obligated to say grace after meal, and it is a suffix. It is questionable if they're obligated biblically because it's a mitzvah saseh, it's a positive commandment that's not time-bound, or if they're only obligated rabbinically because it says for the land that Hashem gave you. And the land was not divided to women, but rather for the men. And the daughters of Tzlafchad, they took their father's portion. And so the question is, what about Tosfos's question? What do you do with the question, what about the Kohanes and the Levites? So here the Alter Rebbe says, in the Kohanim and the Levites, they actually had Arei Migrash. They had lands that they didn't live on that were like extra lands. And so were the Levites and the Kohanes given lands? And the answer is they were given some land. In addition to the fact that they lived on land called the cities of refuge, and there were 48 cities, 42 of their own, and then 6 cities of refuge. But not only did they have those 48 cities, but outside of those cities, there were 2,000 amos. There were certain measurement of area that was given for the Levites. And what it seems like possibly this means is that they were lands that they were able to plant on. So there was Sadei Suchramim, and there was empty lands. There was empty lands, and there were lands that were fields and orchards. So the Kohanes and the Levites, they did have land. Now, normally the translation of Arei Migrash, I always understood to mean the empty lands, not the ones that they planted on, that they had vineyards and fields. But something that I have to look into and see if Arei Migrash could mean both. But in any event, the point that I'm bringing up is that how do we answer Tosfos's question on Rashi? And the answer that the Alter Rebbe is giving to answer Rashi is that, of course, based on a Ramban and Baba Basra, based on other sources, that the Kohanes and the Levites, they did get some type of portion of land, and therefore the Kohanes and Levites are obligated biblically. So in case you're a Kohen and a Levite and you thought you were going to come out of this class with some leniency, the answer is no. There is no leniency. Even if you're a Kohen or a Levite, you are obligated biblically. However, women do have maybe a slight leniency because we conclude it's unclear. The Talmud concludes that we don't know for sure if women are obligated on a biblical level or only on a rabbinic level. Now, what about a ger, a person who's a convert, and he does not have a portion within the tribes? So because the tribes, he's not part of one of the tribes. So a ger that comes into the Jewish religion and he becomes part of the Jewish people, he's considered like one of us for all the mitzvahs. And to them, they were given a land for inheritance. He is obligated just like as if he got a piece of land. So he and the Jewish people are one for all matters. However, women and Kohanim and Levites are not necessarily so. The women are like they're a nation of their own, and the Kohen and Levites, if they wouldn't have been given these fields, they would not be obligated in this mitzvah that was because the Kohens and Levites are like a group of their own, and they're not considered attached to the regular Jewish nation. And also they are divided from them with regard to many of the commandments. So this is a very powerful halachic statement in the code of law. about the fact that a convert is so connected that even though he wasn't on a personal level given his piece of land, but he's part of the Jewish people more than the Kohen and Levites would be obligated in these type of mitzvahs, more than them. They're sort of like in their own entity, while the Ger and the regular Jewish people are part of the Jewish people. It's a very powerful statement. And then the Alter Rebbe continues and talks about the Avadim, slaves, that they're considered, they have laws like women, and so on. In a suffix, a questionable thing in Torah, we have to be machmer, we have to be strict, and therefore women cannot fulfill the obligation for men if they're obligated on a biblical level, because possibly women are exempt biblically from saying grace, only rabbinically they're obligated. And if you're not obligated on a biblical level, you're not considered obligated on the same, and the men are obligated on a biblical level. They cannot fulfill the obligation for men. However, a man who's not obligated on a biblical level, for example, if he only ate a kazayas, he could fulfill the obligation for women who ate more, just like he could fulfill the obligation for men who ate enough to be satisfied. In other words, a man has the ability to fulfill the obligation for women and for men. Even if the man only ate an olive size and the other person ate till satisfaction, he can fulfill the obligation. I see we have a few questions. Okay, Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, did the Kohanim and Leviim get ownership of the land or just the right to use it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There is somewhere in Shulchan Aruch that it talks about if the Kohanes sold, if they sold that property, if they sold their Arei Migrash. So they obviously have the ability to sell. Yeah, in fact, in Chumash it talks about if they are, but they can sell their property that they live on. But even the Arei Migrash, it talks about them selling. So yeah, they do own it. Yes, Ezra.
If they can sell it, they should be like the Ger. If they can sell it, they should be like the Ger. They have ownership of it.
So what it seems like is we're talking about two things. One is a place to live. Another is a place to plant and to grow things. And that's what it seems like. And so the fact that they have a property to live on doesn't necessarily give them that ability to even if they could sell it. But the fact that they have these Arei Migrash, which is extra land, that somehow seems to be the deciding factor that they would be able to say the grace after they're obligated and grace after meal because they have this extra land, which it seems to me it has to do with the fact that it could be planted upon, maybe, or it's extra land, not just to live on, something along those lines. Yes, Ezra.
Well, the Leviim were given cities.
The Leviim were given cities, yes.
And so therefore, isn't that considered part of the land? And that automatically requires them to say Birkat Hamazon. I mean, I don't understand what. I always thought that because they were given those cities, they should be able to say Birkat Hamazon.
So the thing is that the way it's brought here in Shulchan Aruch is that it has to do not with the cities that they're given, but it's the outskirts of the cities. That's what gives them the ability to say grace. It gives them not the ability it gives them the obligation to say grace after meals. So the way I just said to Ben is I think it has to do with the fact about extra land, not land to live on, because it's all about food, the food that grows. You're thanking Hashem for the ability to grow this produce. And in their cities, their lands were not given as lands to grow things. It was given just to live on. Their job is not to be farmers. The job of the farmers are the rest of the Jewish people. The Levites and the Kohanes were not meant to be farmers. So it sounds like their cities maybe were smaller. They were more for, just for, the purpose of living, but not for large properties, large fields.
Right,
That's
but
what it seems like.
the thing is that with each city, you were given land around the city in order to grow things. That and then on top of that, you had the amount of space. You had basically, how far you can walk out of the city and still be considered to be within the city, the tchum. But the other question that I have is that I understand the Leviim and the Kohanim had special whatever it is. However, they didn't do that all the time. They were given specific time periods to come and do their jobs in the Beit HaMikdash, which meant that the remaining time they had to do something. They had to be somewhere. They had to be at home. And so therefore they still had to support their families.
So what are you asking?
So in other words, their cities were like a regular city with planting areas, etc., that they had to take care of.
Uh-huh. So you're basing that on the fact that they obviously had to make a living. That's the source.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I understand Truma and all this other stuff, but that may be true for the times when they were at the Beit HaMikdash and received it when they were on call at that time. But what about the rest of the time when it wasn't their turn to be there?
So Truma and Trumas Meiser, these did not have anything to do with with working in the temple, the weeks that they worked in the temple. That has to do with simply getting it from the farmers. But what it seems like
10% was given to the Kohanim and the Leviim.
Right, not and the main point, not connected to them working in the temple. So it's just any Kohen. But yeah, thank you. But the idea, the idea that they obviously planted, I don't know, I don't know how it looked exactly, but it seems to me like the Levite cities had a different, the goal was differently. So maybe they were smaller, maybe they were per person. They didn't have maybe in the other lands, they were given huge farmlands, and this was, they could put some plants out. Maybe, I'm just, this is my picture is that they had a little, they might've had some plants in their house, but that wasn't, that wasn't their occupation at all. So, their job was to teach Torah, and their job was to work in the Beis HaMikdash, to study and be leaders and spiritual leaders and so on. So that that's the understanding that I have with regard to their land. Now, is it possible some of them had other types of jobs? I mean, maybe, but that wasn't the general goal, and it had nothing to do with the land that Hashem gave them. Right. So in other words, if not for the Arei Midrash, they would not have been obligated in saying grace after meals as a definite biblical obligation, but rather as a questionable biblical or rabbinic obligation.
Rabbi.
Okay.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Well, that's why when we make challah, a fresh challah, we take off a portion for the Kohanim. Isn't that correct? Right.
The challah is for the Kohen. Right. There are a number of gifts that have to be given to the Kohen. It's not only challah. There's the Zroya, L'chayayim, and Teva. There's parts of the animals that were given to the regular animals, not holy animals, not animals that were sacrificed. Right. So, okay. So now that we've gone through the Shulchan Aruch, which gave us a little insight into this discussion here about women being obligated in saying grace after meals only rabbinically and not biblically, the reason for it. And we've also gone through the Gemara about fulfilling the obligation for someone else. And yesterday we touched upon something called with the concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelozeh. All Jews are responsible for each other. And what we said was something very interesting, that although a woman cannot fulfill the obligation for a man because she is not obligated definitely on a biblical level, she's not definitely obligated, let me reword that. She is not definitely obligated on a biblical level. She might be obligated on a biblical level, but not definitely. And therefore, she cannot fulfill the obligation for a man who is obligated on a biblical level. However, we did say that a man who only ate a olive size, he can fulfill the obligation for a man who was fully satisfied. So a man who's rabbinically obligated can fulfill the obligation for a man who is biblically obligated. And the reason for that is something called arvus. We are responsible for each other. And the responsibility for each other makes it as if it's our obligation. So even though we did not eat enough to be obligated to say grace after meals on a biblical level, but we can still fulfill the obligation for someone else. Now, there is a question, if women are part of the arvus, are women considered part of the responsibility for others? In other words, men have a responsibility. We are like co-signers for each other. Now, there is an opinion that questions our ability to make kiddush for our wives. Can men make kiddush for their wife when they come home Friday night? And this is going back to Moshe's question with regard to kiddush. If you make kiddush, if you daven in shul, so you've already recited the biblical obligation of sanctifying the Shabbos. You davened. You said Ma'ariv, you said Mekadesh HaShabbos, you sanctified the Shabbos, you said it with words. You have already fulfilled your obligation of sanctifying Shabbos in shul. You come home and guess what? Your wife wants to hear Kiddush. She did not daven. She didn't say Ma'ariv. So she hasn't sanctified the Shabbos with words yet. She is obligated on a biblical level to recite Kiddush. And you're obligated on a rabbinic level to recite Kiddush because you already fulfilled your biblical obligation. So there's one of the rabbis in the Shulchan Aruch that says, how could you do this? It's a big problem. You can't make Kiddush for your wife if you go to shul and daven and she doesn't daven Friday night. Very, very famous rabbi, huge scholar, questions this ability that we have to make Kiddush. And the reason why he says that is, he says women are not part of the arvus, of the responsibility. They're not part of that idea. And based on that, you can't fulfill the obligation. They're not part of it. So even though you have a mitzvah to recite Kiddush biblically and rabbinically, but you already fulfilled your biblical obligation. So and women are not part of arvus, therefore you can't fulfill you can't fulfill the mitzvah for your wife. One of the other great rabbis of the Shulchan Aruch says there is a way out. He says if your wife says Good Shabbos, she has fulfilled her obligation on a biblical level of sanctifying Shabbos. As long as she wishes someone Good Shabbos, even you, you come home and she says Good Shabbos to you, she has fulfilled her biblical obligation also. And therefore now she's rabbinically obligated and you're rabbinically obligated. And therefore you would be able to recite Kiddush for your wife. Additionally, he says that women are part of arvus. They are considered part of the responsibility mitzvahs that we're all responsible for each other. And because of that, women, even if you are not biblically obligated now, because you already fulfilled your obligation before in shul, just like you can say grace after meals for someone else who is biblically obligated in saying grace after meals, even though you only ate a olive size and you're not biblically obligated, but because of arvus, because we're responsible for each other, you can say grace after meals for the other person. So the same thing applies to a man saying Kiddush for his wife, that he has a responsibility to say Kiddush. He said it already, he's in shul, but he biblically, he is part of this mitzvah. And therefore, even though he already fulfilled his obligation, but he is responsible for your obligation in Kiddush, and therefore he can still fulfill the mitzvah for you because women are included in the arvus, in the being responsible for each other. So that's the discussion here about women being Yaitse Kiddush, fulfilling Kiddush when their husband recites Kiddush. That's a big discussion here. That's one point. The next discussion is when a child has an obligation to do mitzvahs. What is the obligation of the child to fulfill mitzvahs? We call it chinuch, education. There's a major argument between the rabbis. Is the mitzvah of chinuch, the obligation of education, of educational mitzvahs, a child starts doing a mitzvah, is that mitzvah an obligation on the father, or is it an obligation on the son? So in other words, the child says grace after meals. Is that obligation that the child says grace after meals, is that a mitzvah for the son to do, an obligation on the son? And the rabbis established an obligation for the son to do, or is it an obligation for the father to do? Is it an obligation the father has to educate the son?
Yeah.
What do you think, Moshe?
If he reaches the age of chinuch, if he's obligated, I would assume he's.
So you think it's the son? The son.
Yeah, it's patuch. Yeah.
You think it's the son? Okay. Well, that is an opinion, but there is a view that says no. Just like the Torah itself doesn't obligate a child to do a commandment, the rabbis also didn't obligate a child to do commandment, and therefore the mitzvah of chinuch that the rabbis established is a mitzvah on the father and not on the son. Now, Moshe has a very good source to his opinion, and that is our Gemara. Because our Gemara says that a child can say grace after meals for his father as long as his father only ate an olive size.
Right, that's what it says.
If the child is going to say grace after meals, child's obligated on a rabbinic level to recite grace after meal, he could recite the mitzvah, he could recite it and have his father in mind. If the mitzvah is on the father to teach his son, so the child wouldn't be able to fulfill the obligation for the father because the child was never obligated in the first place. It's the father's obligation to teach the son, not the child's obligation. So how could the child be fulfilling the mitzvah for the father when the child never was obligated? Only a child who's obligated in a mitzvah can fulfill the mitzvah for someone else. You have to be obligated in order to fulfill the mitzvah for someone else. The child's not obligated. It's the father who's obligated. So if the child's not obligated in reciting the grace after meal, how can he fulfill the mitzvah for his father? So our Gemara seems to prove that the child has the mitzvah of chinuch, not the father. However, the Ramban, who's the source of the other opinion, the Ramban who says that it's a mitzvah on the father, not on the child, and there is a Rashi that way later on. There's also a Rashi that follows that view. On a later on Gemara, that view, that opinion, does not have the words in their Gemara about a katan. Katan bar chiyuvu. Those words are removed, and because of that, they're able to learn that way because these words were not in all of the earlier Gemaras. There was a version that didn't have these words. And that would be because a child would never be able to fulfill the obligation for a parent. And even though the Gemara earlier said a son blesses for his father, it doesn't say a child. That's a son. A son is talking about an adult son. An adult son can make the blessing for his father. But it's not talking about a child.
I see. Okay.
And so therefore, there are two views here. If a child could fulfill the mitzvahs for others. And that opinion would fit with the Gemara we had earlier. We had a Gemara earlier that said a child cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Megillah for anyone else. He can't say the Megillah, recite the Megillah, and have others in mind. And what's the reason for that? If they're both obligated on a rabbinic level, Megillah is an institution of the rabbis. If the rabbis instituted to recite Megillah, and the child is obligated as a rabbinic obligation, he's obligated to recite, to hear the Megillah, and to say the Megillah. So why can't a child fulfill the mitzvah for others? They're both obligated on a rabbinic level. And the answer is that the child is not obligated. It's the father who's obligated to make sure his child listens to the Megillah, but not that the child's obligated to hear the Megillah or to say the Megillah. And therefore, the child would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah for someone else. That's the reason, because the child is not really obligated in the first place. It's the father who is obligated. This is the Ramban's understanding. Now, we had a Tosfos earlier that said a different reason. Why is a child not able to fulfill the mitzvah of Megillah for his parent, for someone else? And the answer that we had from Tosfos was a child's obligation is a double rabbinic obligation. And because not only is the Megillah rabbinic obligation, but a child's obligation is on top of that. It's a rabbinic obligation. And therefore, it's a double rabbinic obligation. While a father is obligated, while a regular man is obligated one rabbinic, and a two rabbinic obligation does not cover a one rabbinic obligation. And that was one explanation. Another explanation is that really a child can't fulfill the mitzvah for his parent, for others, in general, only in the case of grace after meal is where the rabbis were so strict, therefore they allowed a child to say grace after meal for his father. And that was the first answer of Tosfos on page 15, where he said that Brochos HaMazon is an extra chumrah yasera, more than the biblical law, and therefore with an easy way they allowed people to fulfill their obligation, that to be able to have a child fulfill the obligation of the parent, and that doesn't apply to Megillah, doesn't apply to other cases, Hallel, doesn't apply to other mitzvahs. But regarding grace after meals, a child would be able to recite the blessing for his parent. And that's, of course, that's the source is our Gemara, that a child could recite the Ben Mevarich La'aviv, a child could say the bracha for others. That's because it's such a strict mitzvah to say grace after meals on a rabbinic, rabbinically, the rabbis were so strict, so they made a little leniency. Because they were so strict, they said, you know what, we'll make it a little lenient. We'll allow a child to be able to fulfill the obligation for someone else. I know my time is up, but I do want to do one little more Gemara here. And so let's, we're starting at the two dots. Darash Rav Avira. Rav Avira darshaned. Zimnin Amar La Mishmei de Rav Ami. We're now, 15 lines up from the bottom of the page. Rav Avira darshan, some say in the name of Rav Ami, Zimnin, and sometimes Amar La, he said it, Mishmei de Rav Asi, in the name of Rav Asi. Amru Malachi Hasharis. The heavenly angels said, L'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before Hashem, Rabbeinu Shalayla, master of the universe, Kosav b'seirasecha, it says in your Torah, Asher lo yisafanim, v'lo yikach sheichad, that Hashem does not act favorably and he doesn't take bribes. He doesn't show favoritism. Hashem doesn't show favoritism and he doesn't take bribes. That's what it says in the Torah. V'haloi, and behold, Ata noisin panim liYisrael. The angels told Hashem, you do show favoritism to the Jews. D'chsiv, as it says, Yisa Hashem panav elecha. Hashem shows favoritism to you. Hashem will show favoritism to you. So how does that fit? It's contradiction. In one place in Deuteronomy, it says Hashem doesn't take bribes and doesn't show favoritism. Here it says in the last week's Parsha, Hashem does show favoritism. Yisa Hashem panav elecha, part of the Berachos Kainim, the blessings of the Kainim. Amar Lahem, Hashem told the angels, V'chi lo yasa panim liYisrael, should I not show favoritism to the Jews? Shekasavti lahem b'soira, I told them in the Torah, v'achalto v'savato v'rachto, that you should eat, you will be satisfied, and you should say grace after meal. You'll thank Hashem, your God. And Vehem, and they, the Jewish people, medaktikim al atzmam, they are careful to be say the grace after meals ad kazayas ad kabetza, even if they're not satisfied. If they just eat a olive size or an egg size, even that they say grace after meal. And so there are two opinions, if it has to be an olive size or an egg size. So that's why it says both. But the point is that Hashem says, I shouldn't show favor. They show favoritism to me. They show favoritism to me. I have to. How could I not show favoritism to them? And therefore, how do they show favoritism to me? They say grace after meals, even on a olive size and on an egg size.
And reciprocally, they get long life. They get long life from saying Birkat Hamazon.
Well, Hashem shows favoritism to us. I don't know if it's limited to long life, but maybe.
Yeah.
But the point is, Hashem shows favoritism to us because we are careful about ad kazayas. That even an olive size, we say grace after meal. So I'm just going to conclude with one question you can think about, and that is, we don't just do this because we want to say grace after meal. This is a rabbinic obligation. So why is this rabbinic obligation any more powerful than any other rabbinic obligation that we do? And it's not like we chose to say grace after meals on an olive size. The rabbis established the law. Not that we don't want to, but I'm saying the rabbis established it. This is a regular rabbinic obligation. So all rabbinic obligations we follow. And so Hashem could say, oh, they follow the rabbi, even though I only obligated, one thing, but one day shaking the lulav, and they shake the lulav all 7 days. So many mitzvahs that we do that are rabbinic. And I didn't obligate muktzah, and they even prohibit muktzah on Shabbos. Why this mitzvah is a mitzvah that what's so special, what's unique about the mitzvah of benching that considered like we show favoritism to Hashem, and that makes this a mitzvah that Hashem is so impressed with. He has to show favoritism to us. So I see Ruben wants to answer already, but I want you to think about it overnight. So we'll save that for tomorrow. Mitzvah Hashem. Have a wonderful afternoon, day. Sei gesund, and see you later. Okay.